I'm here today to talk to you about teaching and about learning. And as you might have guessed by now, I'm going to be speaking to you from a particular perspective, and that is of a cognitive psychologist. And so that's where I did my graduate training, and a lot of my early research was on real theoretical stuff in working memory, memory, attention, language, things like that. But then I did what you did. I came to work at an institution that really deeply prizes and cherishes teaching. And so it was really natural that over time I would start to turn my attention more towards applied questions in this field and translational work. And so I started to get really interested in these questions of how we can take the best findings from cognitive psychology and related disciplines like neuroscience to a certain extent and other learning sciences, and put those in the hands of people who are out there working with the very diverse array of students that we have in contemporary higher education. And especially in the hands of people who were, at the time, as I was starting to think about this, pushing out into what was at the time newer modalities, like fully online, blended, and technology-enhanced learning of all kinds. So that's really become my passion, is to work with faculty directly in doing that. And this idea that we should bring psychology into teaching and use one for the other, this is not a new idea by any means. And you still see a lot of people calling for a really more evidence-based approach to what we do. And that's great, but I still find that a lot can get lost in translation. And partly that's because of sort of disciplinary jargon and inside baseball, to pick up on our theme for TOPS. But it's also a matter of sheer volume, right? So there's thousands and thousands of articles that pile up in hundreds of journals every year, all of which could have maybe some relationship to what we do with our students. And it becomes very hard to winnow through and pick through and find out what's the most relevant. So that is what I've tried to do in a lot of my work these days, is find the most relevant work and concepts that can form a framework that can inspire us and give us some basis for making those choices. And I think that this issue of choice is also really germane to instructional technology, right? So when I started getting interested in this, and probably when some of you started getting interested in this, it was really a matter of, is there some technology out there in the world that might help me do what I want to do? And now it's a matter of, I opened my email this morning and here's 10 new companies and they've got 20 new products, and some of them my students have to buy, or maybe my school will, and which one of these things could I possibly use? So we have a lot of choices there as well. And so I think what better way of making choices out of all the things we could do in any given course, what better way than really fundamentally considering how the mind works, right? And so that's the framework that I'll be sharing with you. Some very selected concepts that I think are the most relevant things that everybody in teaching and learning should know about, and especially those of us who are coming at this in new ways, fully online and technology enhanced. So, of course, I'll be fleshing out in our kind of warm-up and framing today exactly how we're going to spend our time together and what these core concepts are. But that's where we'll be coming from. Now, we're also, especially in tomorrow's session, going to be pulling in another aspect of learning science and psychology that I've come around to believe is also absolutely critical for deploying this work as effectively as possible. And that is the science of motivation and self-regulated learning, metacognition, all of those associated concepts that have to do with students putting in the effort and putting in the effort effectively. So that's what I've come to believe is a very, very powerful combination. When we take what we know about what motivates human beings and combine that with what we know about how the mind works, well, then we get activities that are, number one, effective, and number two, that students will actually do. And that's how we get and can elicit the really productive academic effort that I think is really the basis for all student success, period. All right? So that's sort of the big grand framing statement for where we'll be coming from in our time together. Here's a little bit more about how. So here's something I just want to mention up front, and this is really just more of a logistical point. I've put together this very stripped down Google Sites site for you, and this is a place where I've pulled together links, some descriptions of activities, references to research that I'll talk about. It's sort of a one-stop shop that's broken down and organized in the same way that our workshops are going to be organized today and tomorrow. And this is also later in one of your binder worksheets. It's listed there. It'll show back up in the slide deck as well. So, I mean, you can always grab these slides later, but this I find, you know, when you're in the talk, we're kind of frantically scrolling and saying, oh, I have to Google this, or she mentioned this research study. Here's where I've pulled everything together. So you've got that. And if you're a bring your own device type of person, you'll have an opportunity to actually dive into that later when we have our discussions. Okay, so housekeeping and big framing statement. We'll get into, as I said, more of how we'll spend our time together in just a moment. But now that we've had an opportunity to consider the big ideas, let's warm up with a game, if you will indulge me. All right, so this is a bit of an icebreaker with a purpose, which I think you'll see in a moment. And I won't tell you too much more about how exactly it ties to our material, but I'll tell you what the game itself is and give you an opportunity to play. So this is a game that grows out of my childhood. It was invented by my uncle Hal Miller, who was a drama teacher and a really, really great drama teacher that taught high school in Texas for many, many years. And as you might imagine, given what he did, he was really, really into movies. So we played charades, we played all kinds of movie trivia games growing up. And this was one that when charades kind of got old, we could do this in a lightning round fashion. Now here's how the movie line game works, and our modified version that we'll play today. So we're going to start by, I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to think for just a moment. Is there a line or set of lines from any movie that you think that you can remember verbatim? And if you're the super conscientious type, you can write it down, but don't worry, you don't have to turn anything in, and you actually don't have to play out loud if you don't want to. But everybody take a moment to think, is there a movie line or lines that you can remember verbatim? Okay, all right, got that in mind? Okay, so with that, now we have an opportunity to think. Here's how we're going to play. It's pretty simple. You throw up your hand and shout out your line so that everybody can hear. And if you think you know what movie it came from, well, chime in and tell us, okay? All right? All right, so who's going to be brave and go first? All right, yes, Denise.
Hello, my name is Inigo Montoyo. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
Okay. All right, we had to go there first. But and we could be here all day just on that. Do we all know where that came from? The Princess Bride. All right, so Princess Bride is now off the table. Everybody has to cross out their lines. Okay, who else? Yes?
Nobody puts baby in the corner.
Okay, that is from Dirty Dancing. All right, very good.
Play it, Sam. Play as time goes by. Casablanca. Yeah.
All right. All right, very good. Casablanca, yes. I'll be back. But which one? Okay. All right, and let's hear another.
You talking to me?
You're talking to me. You talking? Are you talking to me? All right, okay. Yeah, I know. All right, so it is from Taxi Driver. All right, how about this one? That rug really tied the room together, dude. Ah, The Big Lebowski. All right. All right, you win the morning. It's obviously the best movie of all time. Let's give us one more. Yes. Hasta la vista, baby. Also from the Terminator. Okay, great. Okay, so besides learning a little bit more about each other than perhaps we had intended this morning, you know, this is an interesting reflection on what our memories can hold and what our memories can do. You have really good memory abilities, right? We've got verbatim movie lines. Even if they're not perfect, they're good enough to where other people even know what movie they came from. So who can tell me? Yeah.
I think I've observed that pretty much every line we heard is something that I've heard rehearsed outside of the movie multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
Remembering the movie is remembering the rehearsal of the line.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So, given that, who can tell me the fourth sentence I said when we started today? Verbatim, from like 8 minutes ago. No. All right. Good. And of course you can't. Right? And besides this factor, we've got one factor that's already been put out here of rehearsal. What are some reasons why that is? So you don't remember what you heard 5, 6, 8 minutes ago in an experience that you took time out of your summer to come in and experience, but you remember these movie lines. Yes, Jane.
When you use it again, you're often using it in a very different context,
Mm-hmm.
but a situation that is related. In some
Okay.
fashion.
Okay, so you've retrieved it in some other situation where it had a different context. What else do you think?
The line is initially remarkable. We're not remembering every line from every movie.
No.
There's occasionally one that stands out. and
Yeah.
maybe really pithy, really funny.
Uh-huh.
Pick up on that and note it.
Yeah.
Then we start rehearsing after that.
Yeah. All right. So
There are going to be some things you're going to say that I'll remember, but they're going to be the
Yeah.
usual noteworthy things,
Mhm.
not the fourth sentence from the first paragraph.
yeah. Okay. Very good. What else? Yeah.
I think they also, certain lines become culturally embedded. There's just something about them that
Mm-hmm.
resonates with the culture and time, and it becomes embedded. And then we do hear it rehearsed, whether it's through comedy skits or whether it's through other
Yeah.
phenomena in which, again, it just kind of resonates with the culture. I'm going to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we see pithy. That's partly how the phrase might be, or the line might be crafted, but it's also it ties into something else in our lives. Yes, in the back.
I'm not sure this applies to every film, but I think about this with teaching and what I just corrected a bunch of exams and what students remember.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so something about the moral and ethical center of something and emotionally
Yeah.
versus an intellectual rationale. So that's what they're remembering.
Okay. All right. So things that had some kind of moral or emotional charge to them. Right. One more point.
Well, some things are what we would call today meme-worthy, in that they can be used in other contexts, like "Hasta la vista, baby" can
Yeah.
be repeated endlessly in different variations. And
Yeah.
do the same thing, but yet be riffing off of a previous thing.
Okay. All right. Okay. Right. So another connection to context, and not just repetition, 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 but repetition and processed in some particular way. All right. So you're already picking up on a ton of the themes that we're going to be exploring in our 2 days together that have to do with why some things stick, other things don't, and some of the processes and contexts that promote the acquisition of that information and that knowledge. And this, by the way, makes a great icebreaker in classes too. I use it in almost all of my classes, and obviously you don't have to be a cognitive psychologist to use this one. And as we will return to, especially tomorrow, I think it's a great idea to break down that wall with students too, to say, why do you think that you remember certain things so well? And once you're alerted to those, is that something that you can use in your own studying? So that's our icebreaker. It doesn't trade names or anything. I hope to get everybody's names as we go along. But this frames and maybe introduces some of the concepts that we'll be talking about. So there are 3 core concepts in particular that we'll be unpacking today and tomorrow that have to do with cognition. Out of all the things, those thousands of articles and hundreds of journals that I think that we could use, these are the 3 that I think are the most useful and the most germane for us. So this is just a preview. As I said, we'll be unpacking these in more detail in a bit. But I'm going to put out for you that, where does it start? The first place, I think, is with attention. So this cognitive process, it's an interesting one for many reasons. But when I started researching the book Minds Online and started really getting into this, and looking out at the other books, there's a lot of great books that have been written on the subject, I was really surprised by how many of them did not start with attention as their starting point, right? So this is it is surprising to me, especially because we know as cognitive psychologists that whenever something interesting happens in cognition, when you remember something, when you have an insight, it's like attention has to be first on the scene. So I've qualified it a little bit here, but it's almost as if nothing interesting in human thinking, cognition, or memory is going to happen if attention and focus aren't captured first. So that's something that we'll be touching on. And then there's memory. And of course, we're not going to get off on a terrible foot and imply that memory or memorization is the basis for all knowledge or learning. Nobody I know who does teaching and learning seriously thinks that, right? And I don't think that. But I think more people who work in teaching and learning are saying it's okay to have memory be a part of it. That's all right to say we expect students to build a base of knowledge. And as we've learned more about the interplay between things like memory and thinking, we know that these things complement each other. They don't necessarily compete. It's not that you can think critically or you can remember information. We want both and. But that said, it's important to not have your whole course and all of your teaching dominated just by this aspect of learning. So it's a really good thing that we have a lot of applied knowledge and research about how to make this happen in less time and less effort. So that's the memory piece of it. And then, of course, thinking is what we most want, right? So among the people who do take teaching and learning seriously, this is the thing that to a person, everybody says, well, I want my students ultimately at the end of this course or learning experience to think more like me. I know that's what I would say. You say, what do you really want students to get out of your research methods class or your intro to psych class? I want them to think, if not identically to an expert in the field, a little bit more like I do. I want them to use information and reason the way a psychologist would. That's what I want. But as in so many aspects of our lives, just wanting something really, really badly is not enough to make it happen, right? And especially, I think, as a lot of teaching and learning experts have pointed out, courses do tend to revert to this focus on content during the planning process. We think, we may go in with great intentions of teaching students to think like psychologists or historians or anthropologists, but at the end of the day, we're saying, well, do we include chapter 7 and where should the exams go? It's easy to get dominated by content. So knowledge and thinking complement each other, but one doesn't just fall out of the other. So attention, memory, and thinking, those are the kind of cognitive pegs that we're going to hang our work together on. So here's specifically how we're going to spend our time. So here's what I have planned for you. So we're going to start with overview of some of these foundational principles. So kind of laying the groundwork, first in memory and attention, and then tomorrow in thinking and student motivation. So overview of the principles, what are the foundational concepts? And then we'll transition into a little bit more laid back, hands-on demonstrations, some examples, some details on the principles that I've just shared with you. We've got group application, and you'll see in a bit, I have some sheets prepared for you that I found are really good discussion starters with your engaged colleagues to figure out how can you take this and apply it to the challenges and the goals that you're facing right now with your work. And then, of course, an opportunity to share out and exchange the information. Now, in all of this, you'll definitely notice this is not going to be a very nuts and bolts, in-depth technology-focused type of experience. You have ITCs here who are deep experts and have a wealth of information. If it's a question of how do I make my learning management system do this, or what are my 10 options for technologies to do that, we'll have some examples. But this is going to be about that framework for stimulating your creativity and your knowledge in this. All right, so in our last piece of kind of business here is the all-important question of a break. I will have a break planned probably about midway, somewhere between 9:45 and 10-ish. But as we like to say at my institution, NAU, always feel free to move about the cabin. Nobody's got the fasten seatbelt sign on, so definitely if you'd like to move around, have a break, take advantage of some of our great refreshments, please feel free to do that anytime. All right? So let's dive in. So our topic and our focus for today is going to be that attention and memory piece in cognition and the implications for learning, especially in online and similar types of approaches. So attention is a really absorbing and kind of funny topic in cognitive psychology. It has experienced an explosion of knowledge and research in the last 10 to 20 years. It's really been amazing to watch it progress. But even so, we don't have a single working definition of what attention is. And there's not like an attention spot in the brain or anything like that. But even though we don't have this definition of what does it mean to pay attention, we have a really good understanding of what attention does and what it's for. Right? So as for what it's for, attention is a prioritizing mechanism. So it's a set of mechanisms in the mind and in the brain that allow us to take our limited cognitive capacity, our limited cognitive resources, and on a millisecond by millisecond basis, prioritize where should those be going at any given moment. We may be dividing it among different stimuli or tasks that we're doing. We may be focusing most of it in one direction, but that's what attention is and does. It's a prioritizer. And I think far and away for teachers, the most important thing is the connection to memory. Now, you could have some theoretical quibbles about this, but for our practical purposes, our intents and purposes, we remember very little without focused attention. And this is an idea, it's an old one that goes way back in cognitive psychology, and I think it's one that still holds up today. That if you're going to, as we say, encode or put into memory some new information, something new, you've got to have focused attention devoted to that. And that's a very interesting contrast, for example, to our folk belief, or the belief that many of our students have, that learning happens by osmosis or in the background, sort of by passive exposure. Not a whole lot of that happens. So attention, capturing focus, critical for memory. So even knowing this, then, what gets in the way? I mean, that's a pretty simple principle, right? You have to pay attention to remember. What gets in the way? Here are some of the top issues that I would note. The first one is, as it says up here, cognitive load. So how many people are familiar with that idea of cognitive load? Okay. So this has been a really influential idea, and it's a whole theory unto itself, which we're not going to go through in detail today. But again, for our purposes, here's what's important about the cognitive load concept. So cognitive load, really the core of this idea is that during any learning task, learning situation, there's a certain amount of your cognitive resources that have to be directed towards the learning itself. So I'm learning how to conjugate French verbs, or figure out molecular structures in my chemistry class, or tell the difference between different kinds of research methods. That's going to take up a certain amount of resources. But out of that same limited bank account or pot of attention, resources also drawing so-called extraneous load. So this includes other things not inherently tied to learning, such as, well, I'm trying to do this homework assignment online, but here are the instructions back here in this textbook. And every time I have to toggle, that costs attention. Right? Or maybe I'm using something that I'm not really familiar with yet. I'm in my accounting class and I'm really kind of still shaky on how to use this spreadsheet. I'm not that great at Excel yet, so I'm dealing with that at the same time as I'm juggling these cognitive demands or instructions that are just unclear. So that's one just very basic way of looking at that concept. And why is that important? Because the extraneous demands are ones that we can sometimes control with our design. We can do things like establish expertise in the spreadsheet that students are supposed to be using. Or we can make sure that the instructions are more closely integrated with the materials or assignments that students are doing. So excess cognitive load. Now here's another that also goes back a really long time in cognitive psychology, but I think is one that really bears reviving as a way of looking at focus when students are learning. And this is automaticity. So automaticity is really just what it sounds like. Has to do with what happens when we learn some skill or some set of processes really, really well. Initially, they take up a lot of resources, a lot of attention, and then over time, those attentional demands, maybe they don't disappear, but they are reduced. So some things take less attention, which leaves more left over for other things. Now, I've left that intentionally vague, hoping that you can maybe fill in with some examples, either from classes or from everyday life. So what are maybe some examples of automaticity in play? Yeah. Okay, driving, right. So when you first get in the car, it's, oh my gosh, nobody say anything. I'm just trying to figure out how to grip this steering wheel, and I forget about directions or anything else. And then as we get more skilled, those processes take less. So even if we shouldn't always, we can carry on the conversation and be fiddling with the radio dial and kind of monitoring the directions at the same time. All right, so that's a great example of automaticity. So we'll return to this in a slide or two, but I also want you to think about this in context of classes. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's just about everything we do in class that we look at in these terms. So if you put let's say you had a picture of a molecule up there on the board,
Yeah.
instead of flights, and the
Yeah.
student looking at that, there's a number of things involved here, but one
Yeah.
thing we want them to get beyond is seeing the colors and all of those things and looking at all the details of that.
Yeah.
And you could argue that that is an example of automaticity when a person is able to look beyond the non-relevant details and see the relevant.
Yeah.
Now, there's visual processing stuff going on there too, but
Yeah.
so I also, where I teach plant identification, one of my thing, a good
Okay.
person, a good botanist can identify plants out of a moving vehicle going 60 miles an hour.
Yeah.
That's definitely automatized.
Yeah.
At that point. The students have to make it to that point
Yeah.
where they can do identification of the plants.
Yeah.
I'd even argue to some extent that writing is an automatic, can be an automatic process. What we think is things that are have been thought out by us, and then the student has to think something through. It's kind of a non-mastery level of experience in writing. What we want to get to, where we are, is at a mastery level where we can kind of sit down and automatically organize all of these kinds of things and write
That's right.
those things. It doesn't take the cognitive load we have as an adult or as a professor we have in writing is much lower than a cognitive load of a student who's got to think through the steps and think through does this paragraph make sense. I mean, I write reasonably good paragraphs now, and I never think about whether the paragraphs are coherent or not.
Yeah.
I've done it so many times.
Yeah.
A student has to go look at every paragraph and say, is that paragraph coherent? Is there one idea in that paragraph?
Yeah. I think writing is a great example of this, and it's a bit of a stretch on the one hand to say, well, maybe something similar that goes on when we learn to drive goes on when we learn to write. But I think what you're saying is absolutely right. A student's capacity is being drained off millisecond by millisecond by, oh my gosh, is this supposed to be that keyhole type of essay, and how long, and am I spelling these things right? To play off of that, really one of my favorite examples of this is in writing in APA style, which I know is everybody's favorite thing. I love APA style. I don't have to stop most of the time to say, oh, where does that semicolon go when I need to stick the citation in the middle of my two sentences, and where does the period go, and how does the parentheses end? And students, literally, when they get started, as I did, you have to stop and thumb through and do that. So that's what's going on with the non-expert, with the person who's learning, versus the expert. It's an automaticity process. So yeah, just this is, I think, exactly how this gets the ball rolling for us thinking, just by adopting this, as I said, a fairly old and classic concept drawn from the literature. So when we don't have that automaticity at the lower level, that is going to make attention play out differently. And then there's this, shall we call it, dysfunctional multitasking. Any guesses on where I might be going with that? Okay. Want to throw out maybe a phrase or two? What do you think?
Well, it's based on my personal experiences in a face-to-face classroom. This one,
Yeah.
I actually have a rule that no electronics out because it's a seminar. But there's always sneaking under the desk. And
Yeah.
always, this or that. So.
Yeah.
And they think that they can be in the moment and be present in the discussion and do whatever it is they're doing on the side.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
So.
don't know if that's going where you're going.
Exactly. So, and what it's warming my heart to hear you, as you did, kind of articulate a link between the belief and the behavior. So that's, again, me kind of coming at it as a psychologist, saying these two things, they don't always go together, but they're related. So I think that, well, if something important happens or she starts talking about the final exam or the papers, I'll tune back in. Right, that'll happen. And so I can text my friends and watch this video and do these other things in a face-to-face class. Now, how many people have seen, by the way, there's been a lot of drama and controversy about that, and just dueling op-eds in everywhere from the New York Times to the Chronicle of Higher Ed. How many people have seen or kind of been a little dialed into that? Yeah. And I think that there's been interesting ideas played out on both sides. Of course, I, as more of an online person, I kind of have to laugh when I see some of those, because they'll very solemnly talk about, the learning that students are doing in their classes, and it's clear that they're talking about a student sitting in the traditional lecture with a laptop. And I'm just saying, well, don't you know how many of our students are learning fully online? This issue doesn't go away, but it takes a very different form. And so me just saying, oh, you can do this or not do this when you're in my classroom, that doesn't even relate to us.
I just want to qualify
Sure.
this because I'm not referring to a lecture, I'm referring to a true seminar environment.
Yeah.
Where the tables, we're all facing each other, there are no rows of desks.
Yeah.
We are there to have a Socratic dialogue, whatever.
Yeah.
And you can't affect that if you're not present in the moment. So that's a different scenario, and I wouldn't want to imply that for all classes. But if you're trying to have that type of, and I think it depends on the discipline too, which
Yeah.
one is interdisciplinary, a lot of philosophy and cultural
Yeah.
studies and stuff.
Okay.
So we're facing each other, and
Yeah.
we're supposed to be present to one another.
Yeah.
So.
And we're sometimes still perhaps dysfunctionally multitasking.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And, sorry, we do have we've got a mic too to capture some of this. Sorry about that.
Part of the problem. I have this mental image that my students are sitting at home at their desks, with a few papers strewn about, and a physics textbook next to them, and sitting and thinking and scribbling for, half an hour, a couple hours, like I used to do.
Yeah.
My fear is that they're sitting there with their physics stuff in front of them, and their computer up, and a little Facebook window, and another chat window, and a friend playing a video game aside, and that the idea of isolating themselves and really focusing on one for an extended period of time is just not happening.
Yeah.
I don't know that's true, but I fear that there's a lot, and that's not something I can control in my classroom. That's just,
Really
that
is.
goes to what you're talking about there about beliefs about attention, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. So top three issues to keep in mind as we think about how is attention going to play out in our courses and in our teaching. All right. So here's 3 quick top level, kind of very broad principles or suggestions that I think flow out of this. Several of which we'll return to in some more details, but kind of thinking about it in this way, the first thing is to really be mindful of how long students are going or how much material they're going to be going through without having to respond. So that's also just a very, very basic, well-known principle of attention and attentiveness, is that we're not really set up, most of us, to just have lots and lots and lots of input go by without jumping in and responding. And I know for me, when I tried to start bringing this principle into the way that my online classes were set up, it meant really breaking up a lot of the text and presentation with questions for students to respond to. Now, this is not to say that I think reading a lot of text is a bad thing. It's not. I think that's totally appropriate in a college level course. But sometimes it's a matter of pacing. And as I get into in the book, sometimes people shy away from this, as I did initially, because they're worried about grading. All right, so what if I have an open-ended response question at the bottom of every page of text that students are reading, if they're doing that in my online class? Well, in this case, I think it's a matter of reframing our thinking about this is an opportunity for students to respond. You don't have to go through it and grade every single thing. Right, and this is something we'll also return to when we get into memory, that really starting to think of these response opportunities as opportunities to retrieve and be attentive, that's important. Yeah. Oh, yeah, mic box. Here we go. Woo!
I mean, that comment you just made, it was interesting,
Yeah.
because I'm wondering if you don't incentivize the written assignments, are you not concerned that students won't take them seriously, won't put as much effort in, won't even do them at all?
Right, so when we're talking about a quick response, so for example, if I'm in a psychology class and we're talking about development in preschool, and I say, I might have a question that says, can you relate an experience briefly that fits with this, or have you noticed this behavior among kids that you've seen? That case, I would not, in my mind, that's not so much a writing assignment. That is something that's very low stakes. I would tell students explicitly, don't worry, if I don't want them to worry about format or the quality of the writing, don't worry about it for the purposes of this. I would still go in and spot check. So I sometimes set up systems where I say, look, I'm going to give you full credit for every good faith response, like it's not it's actual legible text. But I'll pull X number of responses and really kind of give those more scrutiny and give you more feedback on them. So there are ways to kind of split the difference that I think can bring about that compromise between the student, like you said, putting in the effort, and me having hundreds and hundreds of things to be giving in-depth feedback on. So it's an idea that I'll put out there.
Can I make one other quick
Sure,
comment?
absolutely.
I've used that type of strategy before, and one of the
Yeah.
things that has become a challenge is
Yeah.
students will make a response that
Yeah.
exhibits very little or completely misunderstanding of what we're working on. And so now it's a low-stakes assignment where
Yeah.
they've shown that they really don't understand what we're doing.
Ah,
And
okay.
I feel like if I don't penalize that,
Yeah.
then I'm not letting them know that they're making a mistake that they don't understand. Otherwise, if I just spot check and say, okay, you did it, you tried,
Yeah.
they get the sense that, oh, I understand
Yeah.
what was being taught, and they didn't.
Yeah, and they really didn't. I'm going to put that out to the group. What do you think might be a good response, or how might you treat that as an opportunity in your online class? So I put that out for, say, in a child development class, and people start relating things that are absolutely not relevant to what they were supposed to have read, or coming up with concepts that are actually just wrong, which happens a lot in psychology. What do you think might be your next step as the teacher? You read those and you realize from the first few responses that we have some real issues here. What do you think? And we can throw the box. Oh, over here. Here we go. Very active learning. Here we go.
I think in that case I would do like a video, not chat, but like a video
Yeah.
talking about what were good examples,
Yeah.
so that if they watched that, then they could maybe connect that.
Okay, so a sort of an on-the-fly video that where you'd look at, maybe there are some responses that were spot on and use those to model for the rest of the class?
Yeah.
What else do you think you could do?
Sorry. That's the fun part.
Yeah, there we go.
Well, I stumbled onto this accidentally, but
Yeah.
one thing I found out is if you have students include some kind of a graphic in their online responses, then you can go immediately to that graphic and see whether they are understanding what you're talking about.
Okay.
Couldn't hear the question at all.
Okay. All right. So we're thinking about, or I just put it out to the group to have.
No, sorry.
Oh, his answer. All right. Does it have to be a written response? Is how I would summarize that. It doesn't have to be written, so perhaps even something like a graphic would allow you to quickly skim through and identify misunderstandings. Yeah, yeah. All right. So just that idea. I mean, that's it, is to say, all right, if the big purpose is to get students responding, how are we going to, what are some opportunities to do that? And how are we going to handle different contingencies such as, wow, the whole class didn't understand, we have a few responses that are way out of left field, or the sense that students are not taking things seriously, and we can adjust accordingly. Sure.
Along with that, and the idea of automating lower-level processes,
Yeah.
part of my problem is that I have such a spread of students in my class.
Yeah.
Physics and math is a lower-level process.
Yeah.
It ranges from completely non-existent to skill set to
Yeah.
a problem. I
Yeah.
don't bore the students to death who have those skills automated, but I also want to address this issue with the other ones. I'm teaching in a
Yeah.
face-to-face situation. I can't do quite the same self-pacing that I could online. Can you speak to that kind of spread spectrum class at some point today or tomorrow?
All right.
Strategies for
I will
dealing with that?
I'll give that some additional thought, but at the risk of sounding a little too pep talky, I think that this is one of the great affordances of online. At least it's supposed to be. That's sort of the big promise of fully online courses and personalized learning and things like that, is the ability to assess students on skills once you've identified them. I mean, you as the expert know, okay, if they've got this, then they can move on. If they don't have this, they really need to practice. And set up those, if not gates that students have to pass, those benchmarks for what students need to know. So yes, I think going into it, if you know that your discipline breaks down like this, I mean, and I think all of us, we can think more about what are those points that I think they're sometimes called threshold concepts. That, yeah, if students don't get this, they are not going to make it much farther. Just to kind of think off the top of my head in psychology, if students don't get early on the distinction between causality and correlation, they can't start to pick that out if I describe it to them. Here's two things that are correlated versus I can really say one led to the other. Then they're really going to have a lot of trouble interpreting studies, and they're going to have a lot of trouble setting up and interpreting their own studies later on. So that's something that has to be rehearsed and assessed, and ideally that every student gets early on. So yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. So I think breaking this down, getting back to that idea of automaticity, is it APA style? Is it being able to just pick out causation and correlation? What are the things that can be made automatic? So now that you've had a few moments to think about this, what are some other examples that people can contribute of lower level processes in their discipline that students can have just practiced and down pat, and that will leave more capacity for the higher level stuff in their assignment? So what are some other examples you can think of? So we've got APA style. Yeah.
One thing I talk to the kids about is about maps and mental maps, and I find that a lot of college freshmen go to UNCG, and I teach community colleges in this area. I've had kids think that England is Montana, and so
Oh.
I now teach geography with every history class.
Okay.
Oh gosh, no.
No, no, no. Gotta
So that practice, having those maps mastered, also teaches them the framework of the history I'm trying to teach by not just giving the American map, but also the African and European map.
Okay.
And I know that, I'd also teach them that the political boundaries are arbitrary, but they got to start somewhere to have containers in their minds to hold the information of the class the way that it's taught. I don't know if that's relevant to what you were saying.
So basic geography. You don't have to stop and ponder, oh my gosh, is England and Montana or not? They do, some of them. So that's something that can be automatized before they move on. What are some other examples? Have we got one more? Yes.
Basic writing skills, knowing when to punctuate, how to punctuate, whether sentences are complete sentences or not. Because experienced writers write and they know that they have written a complete sentence and it's grammatically correct. But developmental writers often won't know those things. Is this a complete sentence? Do I use a comma here? Do you use a semicolon? And that makes the expression of their ideas when they're trying to balance those two tasks, expressing their ideas and writing correctly, it makes it very challenging.
All right, I think grammar drills and really learning and knowing about grammar, I think we all know that went out of fashion for a while, but it's really functional to be able to do that, and it does make it does make us better writers on the idea level as well. I believe that is too. So, here's one more example. I say up here, consider incentivizing speed. Now, this is not appropriate for every kind of assignment out there, but I want to just plant a seed in your mind that it's at least a possibility. Now that we're working in learning management systems that tell us sometimes if it's an auto-graded assignment, not just were students correct or incorrect, but how long did it take them to do this? So some time ago, I worked on a project with a colleague of mine who recently retired, but a really, really engaged and accomplished teacher named Elizabeth Brower. And she teaches electrical engineering, or taught electrical engineering. And in our many conversations, me and Elizabeth, she told me that one of her central problems with her elementary circuit analysis classes is that students wouldn't have these certain principles down pat and frankly memorized. And one of these, for example, is something called Ohm's law, which please don't ask me to explain, but she said it's a really foundational concept. And she said her students would come to this with the idea that, well, I can look it up, right? When I run across it, I'll just go and find it, right? Age of information. And she said, if you have to look up Ohm's law every single time you go to analyze a circuit, you are not going to last as an electrical engineer. So we recrafted some of her assignments, not in a super high-tech way, but that would have a set of really infinitely repeatable, kind of remixed problems that would all tap into this same principle. And those were set up online. And the way that she presented them to students and graded them was that your final grade on this homework assignment was based not just on the best of your attempts, so you got multiple attempts to go through lots of problems, and your grade reflected how well you did, but also how quickly you completed it. And I say this is not appropriate for everything. I mean, a lot of the time we're trying to do the opposite, to tell students, okay, slow down and take your time. But if it is one of these lower level, let's automate it, have it down pat types of skills, like where does the comma go, then this might be a good way to approach this. All right. So she and I did some work. It's reported a little bit in the book, kind of showing how students, you could see them getting better, but also getting faster at these particular principles. And then lastly, oh yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that there's room for for also having some incentive for speed with the higher level processes? I'm sorry. And the reason I say that is a colleague and I taught what we call a content production course this last semester. I'm in communication studies. And one thing that we realized was that students, we were doing things like blogs and podcasts and helping them create social media posts very quickly. What we found was that they were having a lot of trouble getting to the point that they could actually produce something. So they had the background, they had the knowledge, but even though we would say, okay, 25 minutes, go. You know, make it happen in the next 25 minutes. Our hashtag for the class became get it done, literally, right? Because that was a skill that they really, really struggled with. They really struggled with like getting to a point where they could get ready to do something. I didn't know if anybody else was having that. So my thought was that in online classes, that might be kind of a fun challenge. You know, if you've got a product-based course in some way where even at the end you say, okay, we've been practicing this, I'm going to give you 25 minutes. When you start the timer, create this timeline, go. Because we do live in such a fast-paced world, and they're going to be asked to do things very quickly. Put up a social media post that is appropriate, that can go out immediately. There might be value in actually doing it at the higher levels as well.
So, and just to kind of reflect on what you said, one of the things that stand out to me, I mean, you've connected it to how experts should ultimately perform in your field, in your discipline, so it makes sense. And it sounds to me like you're also framing it to students not as this, you know, deadly under the gun kind of thing. You've thought through, why is this timed? Why do they need to get these things done quickly and have some things that they don't have to look up every time? So conceptually, you've worked through that. So what level the skills are at, I think, are less relevant than the way that you've really framed that and contextualized it. Yep.
I'm not sure that this distinction between higher level skills is really very helpful.
Okay.
Because I think what we're doing is we're saying that the skills that are automatized are the lower level skills, and the skills that we're still learning, those are the higher level skills. But a great writer has got all of those skills, which we say are higher level skills, automatized. And so for them, they're lower level skills. And they're dealing with a much different level of where they're struggling with. They're struggling with character development or something in a novel and things that are not, you know, within all the stuff, all the higher level skills, so to speak, what our students have. So I really love automatization. I think that it's a very powerful idea that we do not pay enough attention to. I think the example is great that we just had about automatizing a so-called higher level skill. I don't think higher level really works for us. I don't think we should be thinking in those terms, because experts automatize things that we think are really high level, and it's the expert novice distinction that I think is more important than the higher lower level skill distinction.
Yep, point well taken. I mean, coming at it from a cognitive perspective, you know, another way to kind of break this down to me is also kind of novel versus routine. When we are combining novel information, either to encode it or to produce it, that's always going to take focused attention. I don't think that anybody is ever going to be able to be, you know, carrying on a conversation, right, and then putting together a complex argument for a paper or doing character development. So there's that piece of it. But yeah, that's probably splitting hairs for most of our purposes, which is what I like about your comment. It brings us back to, okay, what are we trying to?
I do have actually a counterexample to that,
Yeah.
and that is Steve Martin when he was doing commentary.
Yeah.
He describes his comedic experience and why he got out of it.
Yeah.
Because he's living in the moment, but his mind is rushing 1,000,000 miles a second trying to figure out what he's going to do next.
Yeah.
So he's doing, at that level, where he's got 5,000 people in the audience, he's trying to do both of those things at the same time, and you get to a point where you're doing those complex things at the same time. Real mastery.
All right, real mastery of Steve Martin. Okay, that's a good example. All right, so, and this last piece about the digital, you know, really leveling with our students and challenging them to think through their assumptions about and their beliefs about dysfunctional multitasking. We actually have a module that we developed at Northern Arizona to address this, and I'll share that out with you after our break in some more detail, and even show you a smidgen of data that we have coming in that we may be able to impact these beliefs in pretty short periods of time, which is a great thing, I think. All right, so those are just 3, as I said, top-level, very general applications that we can consider. Now, moving on to memory, which we've already opened up to a certain extent, here are some principles to remember. Okay. So first off is not so much a particular factor finding about memory. It's really kind of a mindset shift about how memory scientists have reconceptualized what memory is and how it works in the last couple of decades. So if you took Intro to Psychology or Cognitive Psychology a while back, and you even still see some vestiges of this old idea in some books, you may have seen it described a little bit like an assembly line, right? So here's this box, and here comes your sensory information, and some of that makes it to the next step on the assembly line, and that's short-term memory, and some of that gets passed over to long-term memory, and then you pull it back out. So there's this kind of container metaphor for memory, which we really no longer believe. The 3 boxes was a nice starting point, but that theory is now having its 50th birthday pretty soon, and we don't look at it that way anymore. So contemporary theories of memory, I mean, they're really, there are a number of them, they're complicated, but I think more of us share this underlying way of looking at the problem, which is really, what is memory for? So instead of thinking about it as a place and I can put stuff in it, it's a capacity that our minds and our brains have evolved to keep us alive. It's an adaptation. And so when you think of memory that way and you look at it that way, then it becomes a lot clearer why some things stick, and they may stick after one exposure for a lifetime, and other things just really don't. And I think it also becomes a useful frame to see students' learning and students' memory through, right? So we remember things that fit our goals, that fit our purpose. We also know, as in so many aspects of cognition, that context is really important. So sometimes if something is in long-term memory, it's not so much a matter of, hey, where can I put it? It's in there, but it's a question of how you get it back. So cues become important as well. We don't remember things don't pop into memory just our conscious awareness because we will them to or want them to really badly. They do because they were cued by something. So like when I'm here and I see a magnolia tree and I have not seen one in many, many years, that's a cue that reinstates a lot of information that I didn't even realize was in there, all right? So our memories are there to help us retain information that's likely to help us survive, and it's also there to cue that particular memory in the right place and time when that would be appropriate and useful, so context. And depth of processing and just generally what we do with information is also a huge determinant of whether we're likely to retain or remember it later. So here's another old classic. It's one that teachers have used even if they don't realize they're using it. We've used this one for years, but it's a good one to have in our minds as well. So the depth of processing effect, how many people have heard of that one? Okay. So or it's also sometimes called levels of processing. So levels of processing is something you can demonstrate with, say, a classic experimental paradigm where you give people say, lists of words, and they look at them and you say, do something with each one of these words. And in one condition, you might have them just say, oh, is it uppercase or lowercase, or what font is this in? So doing so-called shallow processing. Other people would look at that same list of words and you'd ask them, hey, would that fit in this sentence? Or in my favorite variation on this, which you can also try on your students sometimes, you can give people a list of adjectives, and all they do is sit there and say, does this adjective apply to me? They don't even have to write anything down. Well, then you spring a surprise memory test on them, and as you can guess, the people who have processed those words in terms of the meaning, or especially if it relates to themselves, are more likely to remember that same exact list of words. So what we're doing, even if you can't see it on the outside, is hugely powerful for memory, so depth of processing. So here's a couple of other really important principles. So for most people who have typical visual abilities, seeing information that comes in some kind of visual format, be it a diagram, an animation, a photograph, that is a lot more memorable than information that comes in another way. And there's a lot of different reasons why this is, and part of this probably has to do with just the fact that about a third of our cortex is devoted just to visual processing. We're very visually oriented creatures as a species. But it's also true that you can tap into this effect even if the information didn't come in visually in the first place. You can also think about information visually, visualize it yourself, and still get a boost in terms of memorability. But of course, this doesn't have to do with matching the visual styles of some learners, as I would probably suspect that this group has caught on to by now. Learning styles in the sense of visual learners and auditory learners, kinesthetic learners. This idea was considered really fishy by cognitive psychologists for a long time, and now there's been a number of studies that have frankly debunked this notion. So it's not really matching different learning styles. And by the way, if you ask people about their learning styles, most of them will insist they're visual learners anyway, and think, well, that's most of us. So it's not that reason. It's something that's more just true of how most of us are set up. And then there are a couple of findings that come specifically not out of the theoretical, but out of the applied memory literature, which I think we should all know about, everybody in teaching and learning. So I'll share those with you. So in the research that really just looks at retention of information in situations like college classes, here's the three. And the first is the testing effect, which is also goes by the name retrieval practice. So once again, how many people have some familiarity with the testing? Okay, good. This is like a success story in applied cognitive psychology because it's really flowing out into people's practices. And that's really heartening to see. So for those who are less familiar with it, here's, and for those who are, here's a quick refresher. So the testing effect also comes down to what we do with information, all right? Processing, impacting, whether you remember it later. So according to this principle, when we quiz ourselves, we have to actively pull information out of memory, answer any kind of a question about it, anything that's test-like in nature. That gives us a better chance, a better improvement in remembering that information later than virtually anything else you can do with that same amount of time. Period. And this is not just one or two studies. This is a big stack, a big body of literature that has built up over years. So that's obviously big news for teaching and learning, right? So taking the test, taking a quiz, that impacts memory. Now the spacing effect is another one that has a lot of basis in the research literature, and it also goes by the name distributed practice. And this is one that many of us, we've picked up on this intuitively, even if we don't know the name. This has to do with really how you've spaced out the time, so the timing with which you've engaged with material. So let's say we have a nice ideal scenario where we have 4 hours to study for something, right? 4 hours to study for an exam. We are going to get more out of that time if we break that up into 2 2-hour sessions, even more if it's 4 one-hour sessions, and so on and so forth, down to really pretty fine-grained slices of time, okay? So spacing, not just what you do, but when you do it. And then lastly, interleaving, and then we'll take a break and resume a little bit around 10 o'clock. Okay. Now, interleaving, I have to present this and kind of couch this quite a bit because unlike the other two, this is one that's a relative newcomer on the scene. It doesn't yet have the piles of research to back it up. We're still kind of figuring out the ins and outs of how interleaving works and why. And it's also not something that's relevant pretty much no matter what you're studying or doing like the other two. Interleaving is a principle that applies primarily in two specific situations, and you'll know if these apply to you or not. So the first is a situation where students are having to learn to discriminate among categories, okay? So discriminating, is it a this or is it a that? Or situations where we're having to learn to apply different ways of solving problems. So here's a problem, should I apply this kind of solution or that kind of a solution? So knowing that, real quick, are there any examples that people can think of, or perhaps from your own practice, where students are having to categorize, it's a this or a that, or which solution, which problem type should I, solution type should I apply?
Only all of physics.
Only all of physics, okay, great. Okay, well, just that one, which is only the basis of all reality. Okay, so, and maybe flesh that out with quick example?
Mechanics, and
Okay.
students have to- they start with basic descriptions of motion and Newton's laws, forces,
Okay.
and they want to spend the rest of the course doing everything with that, even though I teach them energy conservation, momentum conservation, angular momentum conservation, they still want to go back and use the piece of physics that they first encountered.
Okay.
And it's hard to get them to consider multiple possible solution
Okay.
approaches and different principles to apply.
Right. And you, the expert, you can glance at the problem and you immediately know. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I know in intros, research methods and statistics, they need to look at it and say, oh, is this one of these problems where we apply a t-test or an ANOVA? I can tell immediately. And they may know t-test or ANOVA and be able to do that once I tell them, but that's part of the task is to figure that out. So how does this relate to interleaving? And let's see. No problem with advancing. Yeah. So it's a neat principle, not just because it's one that can help boost memory, but also because it runs counter to student intuitions and approaches about how they tend to set up their studying. So I'm drawing here on another kind of is it a this or a that type of learning. Let's say that part of my art appreciation course is I need to be able to tell artistic styles, right? So am I looking at Van Gogh? Am I looking at Manet? Or am I looking at Degas? So if you sit down students, you know, how would they set this up for themselves? If they're setting up, say, a flashcard deck or they're going through the material, would they look at all of their Van Goghs first, all of their Manets, all their Degas? Or would they do it like this? Scramble the deck. So what most students will gravitate towards as a strategy is the so-called blocked strategy. I want to deal with all of this, all of that, then all of the other thing. I want to learn the t-test, study the ANOVA, and then I'll go on to chi-square. But interleaving tells us that you're going to get more out of that practice with that flash deck if it's all mixed up. It feels terrible while you're doing it, but that's what, for various reasons, is going to make students a lot more competent and actually retain in less time the ability to categorize or to say, hey, this is one of those where I have to do the t-test or the ANOVA. Oh, yeah. And we got the box. Here we go. Sort of blends in with the tabletops, too. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Going back to that example, is there a value in starting rather than interweaving all 9 together, interweave one of each style just so they're having to deal with just the 3 archetypes?
Right.
And then introduce additional one of each kind, and then introduce so that...
Right. So in general, what you're describing is kind of an expanding practice. So I'm going to start with 2, then I'm going to add a 3rd, and I'm going to practice all 4 of them together and then add a 5th. That, in general, is a really good and powerful strategy. But I don't think in the interleaving literature yet we've figured out, okay, should you start with 3 or start with 4? Does it depend on the discipline or situation? But I think most of the research that I've seen, it is in the kind of 4 to 5 category. We aren't throwing 20 different discriminations among students or just starting with 2. It's sort of in that medium range. But I think that's another to kind of stay tuned on. Or if you're already having to use this principle in your courses, to be, at the very least, doing an informal tracking on what seems to be ideal. So how does that strike with your intuitions?
Well, rather than focus on the number, I was really getting at having an archetype of each style so that the students could really tune into what the similarities and differences are, and then add complexity by adding more of each style over time.
All right. Which is I think still similar to that principle. Let's start with, you use the word archetype. We would probably just use a slightly different term, prototype.
Right.
Like the best example of X. Right. And we do build categories, or some people think we build categories around those, so that is a good starting point. And then let's have it work out to maybe less good or less typical examples.
Or less differentiated.
And less differentiated.
For its finer gradation. So.
Yeah, nice. Yes, Joel. Woo, there we go.
better.
Good catch.
So, let's say that you take the totally scrambled deck approach. How are you going through that deck? Or you take the first one and say, who is this? And then you give them the answer, and so then they get a little bit more information on that, and then you go to the next one. Is that the way you approach it? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we're assuming that some kind of a basic flashcard type of strategy, or you could also call that retrieval practice, okay? I think that's a dégâts. Am I right? Oh, I was wrong. Okay, maybe I need to go back and look at that prototype again. So it's not saying, hey, let's just throw a bunch of scrambled information at students and hope they pick it up. We're assuming that they have some foundational, familiarity with the concepts or some kind of training phase, and then this is practice and developing that skill. And doing it in an interleave fashion supposedly gives that much of an edge to students, even though it does run counter to intuition. And this time I'm going to try to throw. Here we go. Catch. Woo.
I'm afraid this is shameless self-promotion, but I've
Go for it.
developed software that does all of those things.
Good.
And also we uses visual processing, and it's all free, and I'd love to talk to people about it. I work with interleaving and spacing effects and testing effects all the time in my class, and we got 25% better test performance.
See?
We did a controlled study on this in the classroom, so I would love to have a chance to tell people about it and get you using the software. If you work, it's mainly meant for visual processing kinds of things, so it would work great on art history like that. I use it for plan identification.
Okay.
But
All right.
I would love to tell you about it.
All right, and that's actually a really good trend. Well, we have a couple more comments, and then we're going to transition into a break where you can have that conversation. So let's throw it here and then throw it in the corner.
Thanks. I was wondering, for spacing effect, how do you define a gap? Like, how long does it have to be? What counts as a gap? And how do you use that within a classroom where you have 50 minutes, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, and time is sort of the essence? Would you recommend using this within classrooms?
Well, you're right in that, or if I'm picking up correctly, that is going to introduce some logistical challenges if you're going to use it in, say, truly a 50-minute sitting in a face-to-face situation or session. But I think that we can get some hints from our understanding of why it works, and there's probably several reasons why that all work together for why it works. But one reason may have to do with those contextual cues. So like in the classic cramming situation, part of the problem is I spent my 4 hours in the library in the same lighting situation, I've got the same mood, all this stuff, and the information becomes excessively linked to those cues. And so when I go take my exam in the building next door at a different time of day, then I really have a problem. So that means that in theory, anything that breaks up those contexts, and context can be everything, even in the same physical setting, if I move around or I feel differently or I'm taking a different perspective on something or I'm doing something different, every one of those little contextual cues can help break up that context dependence. So with that, it's not so much a matter of, okay, it's 3 minutes or it's this many minutes. It's what am I doing, and I should have some different cues getting tied up with the material, break up how I feel, break up what's going on. That could help you take advantage of spacing even in a short phase of time. But most of it, honestly, is looked at over longer stretches of time, not, say, within a single hour. Help a little bit?
So it sounds to me like you're defining gaps based on changes of context, not necessarily gaps of time.
I think that's what makes the most sense given what we understand about why it works. Yes.
I'm going to ask this question for all of those of us who are challenged from last week's grading extravaganza. So for interleaving, are you actually saying we skip the categorization phase? And I'm asking that because I feel like, this is where I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like we sort of would recommend that this is how students would study anyway, that they would understand each concept as a whole. We said we have to have a foundation, but then they would mix them all up and try to test themselves. So is interleaving, is that what interleaving is, or is it actually just eliminating the time where we look at things individually and just throwing it all out there and learning it?
I think what you described first was a really good description.
Okay.
Yeah, establishing the categories first, and that can look very different in, say, an experimental paradigm versus your class versus your class. But yeah, we should understand, you know, what is different. What is it about Degas that connects to his style? But when I go home and I'm going to spend my time trying to establish that knowledge base and make sure that I can do it when the test comes, I'm going to be a lot better off if I use the interleaving strategy. So yeah, it's one I share with you, but boy, does that one have lots of qualifications around it. Spacing, testing effect, retrieval practice, those are kind of bomb-proof principles that can carry across a lot of different situations. Okay, and speaking of the catch boxes, well, this is a little opportunity to practice that low-level skill, which I'm still working on here, getting catch boxes around. I thought we'd start by having some general question and answer before we kind of proceed on to the rest of what I wanted to share with you about memory, and then our examples and demonstrations of memory and attention. Now, of course, we're going to have about the last hour together. We're really discussing in depth with colleagues and us together some of these. But if there's any kind of other intermediate questions you want to throw out, this is a good time to do so. All right, so Q&A so far. All right, we've got.
Sorry, I forgot about that.
All right.
You were saying that changing the So you were saying that changing the settings where the students study would help for them to memorize and remember?
Yes. Yes, and this is something that grows out of, again, the applied memory literature. And it's related to spacing, but I can expand on that a little bit. The idea of changing the context where you're studying. And this is a piece of advice that does run counter to what you see in some study guides of always have your routine, your time, and your place where you go to study. And that may have some advantages for other reasons, getting the student into a routine, motivating them, but from a memory standpoint, it's counterproductive, again, because we start to associate that time and that place excessively with the material. And so, like one really eminent worker, researcher in this field, Bob Bjork, I remember in grad school, he was working actually with firms that were training people in military, and I think he worked with a nuclear power plant once to train its workers. And they said, well, we have people do it the same way every time. We're really consistent. It's very realistic. And he would tell them that is exactly the wrong approach. You want people executing those skills and recalling what they need to recall different times a day, different places. That's what breaks down the cue dependence and gets us out of that terrible blanking out phenomenon, which we can sometimes have. That's one reason why that happens is, okay, I'm going to my new place, my new time, trying to retrieve that information. Oh my gosh, I just don't have it. So that's sort of the way that context, cues, memory, and something like study routines can all interact with each other. So yeah.
Should we apply that to the classroom?
What do you think?
I think we should.
Okay.
If that is right, should we apply that to our online classes? Because students want to see everything very similar. They don't want to everything very simple. Repeating the modules for each lesson. Should we totally disregard that?
Okay. Right. You know, on the one hand, I mean, maybe this breaks down into kind of how our tasks or, you know, what we do in, say, a given week. There's a routine of we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. And I think a modular structure where week 3 looks a lot like week 4, looks a lot like week 5, that's good because students are not struggling at the beginning of the week with, oh my gosh, when is the discussion post due? And what's this new kind of assignment? So I think that's a good thing. But when we're talking about encountering and using materials, if I need to remember what's the difference between correlation and causation, then that's when this, hey, use it in a different context, use it in a different way, use it in a different setting, remember it in a different time, that's when that principle becomes helpful. Does that distinction make sense to those who are, what do you think?
It's not for the structure of the class, it's more for the content that you're teaching.
Well
and
put.
for the applications.
Yeah. So this is not an argument for, hey, let's upend everything and just throw things at students and sink or swim. Definitely not. So structure, predictability, routine is good. The content, breaking up the context, making it new, tackling it in a different way at different points in time, then that's good. All right, well articulated. All right, what else? Yeah.
So I think I lost my question while you were asking it.
We were pondering structure versus content.
I'm sure it was a good question.
All
I'm going to have to pass for now.
right, and when it'll be cued by something and it will pop
It
into
will.
memory, and there'll be a reason for that.
It will. As soon as I give the box to somebody else, it's going to come back. I know.
I think so. Right, yes, Dave.
Bob Duke at the University of Texas is a music researcher, music educator, works a lot with music psychology, and he's done a lot of studies with skill development in musicians. And the traditional approach is to work on the basic foundational skills and build in a very sequential manner. And what he's discovered in his studies is when they go out of sequence like that, they start out in sequence, but then go out of sequence and go all over the map, they break through what would be a glass ceiling. Because what they found out with that traditional approach is the students start gaining skills very quickly, but then the curve levels off. And when they go out of sequence to do exactly what you said, they break through that and they're able to get further.
Right, so there's some parallel things going on in cognition and music.
It needed that come back as soon as somebody else was talking.
There you go.
So the idea of making particular things memorable for students has a gotcha I've seen.
Okay.
I've encountered lecturers and other kinds of presenters who stress every single sentence so much with so much emotion to make it memorable that it all becomes one long stream, and not everything can be memorable. Attention is finite. Which raises the question of how much do we try and pack into a class or a learning activity? How much can we really expect them to focus on, and what do we do with the rest of this stuff? You see what I'm saying?
Right, and you know, in a way, perhaps it's reflected, that exact concern is reflected in what I think we can all see is a trend in teaching and learning towards, you know, depth over breadth, right? So stressing foundational concepts that we as experts pick with discretion over, well, let's see how much of this book we can pack in. So that's a tension we all have, but I want to put that out to the group as well. So you've identified you can't stress every single thing. And early on in my career, I would hear people say, well, everything in the book, every single thing I say, students should have that. And I'm going, oh my gosh, that will never happen for all the reasons in cognitive psychology. So what are some ways that plays out in our teaching and our structuring of courses? What do you think? How have people dealt with this in their own practice?
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm answering what you just asked, but I was kind of reacting to what I've been
Please do.
hearing and what I've been thinking for a while now, which is it seems, I mean, there's no doubt that memory and attention, all of that is important to all disciplines. But yet, as I listen, it seems to me there could be some distinctions across disciplines as to how certain principles are applied.
Right.
So, for example, if you're teaching a subject or in a disciplinary area where factual information and things that can be more measured are the foundational things that you're trying to get across, and that's one thing. But if you're coming from a more humanities-based field, for me it's more about making meaning of content, not necessarily memorizing specific key facts. And that's a different kind of thinking, and it's a different kind of, and I'm not saying that we don't do that kind of thinking with more measurable type information, but there to me is a qualitative difference.
Okay.
And I'm not measuring my students by every single thing that I want them to remember. I want to see how they're thinking about it and how they're creating meaning from it as well. So I am new at the concept of online learning. I'll be doing it for the first time, so I'm learning a lot, and these are just some of my reactions and thoughts in the process. And your comments would be most welcome.
Can I ask, can you characterize what some of the assumed knowledge that you think that students are coming to your courses with?
Unfortunately, not a whole lot.
Unfortunately, not a whole lot. And how do you?
Well,
how
I'm
do you
teaching mostly
navigate
freshmen.
that?
I'm teaching
Right.
mostly freshmen, and very interdisciplinary. But my background is very strong in philosophical study and philosophy of education in particular. And so I'm introducing them to, I think, very many new concepts. So I want to see how they're thinking about it. I want to see how they're engaging it, how they are interpreting. It's not a matter so much of correct, incorrect.
Right.
But how they're thinking about it and the kind of discussions that can ensue from it and the kind of meaning they can make as they go forward. And for many people, this is abstract. It's not realistic in the 21st century. I actually think it's more needed than ever to actually reinforce the more measurable and the more expedient and all those other things. So I'm not discounting STEM, the whole argument, STEM versus humanities, or many of the other dualities that are going on in education. But I think there's a place for all of it. And I think they're all very important. And so depending on your discipline, that's what you're going to bring to the table.
And I think we'll be picking up, especially on some of those themes in tomorrow's work, where we're going to tackle the thinking skills more in depth. But I would bet that you know it when you see it. Right, when students are performing the kind of, whether it's reflection or analysis or whatever term you want to place, you know it when you see it.
Right. And first of all, in this type of course, they have to do what I call deep reading. They have to attend to the reading. And it's not just a matter of pulling out some key facts, or if I read this many pages, I'll get the whole chapter because I've got the essence of it. You've got to really, and this is not something that's necessarily emphasized, and I could go on forever and I'm not going to, but I used to work in K-12. I know what that's all about, and I know what the emphasis is there. And so I do think that undergraduates do come to classes like mine with a bit of a deficit. But that doesn't mean they don't need it, and it doesn't mean they can't rally around it. They can. But it's different for them. It's kind of like entering a little bit of foreign territory. Yeah.
Yes, I'm interested in this question of how to parse the important stuff and less important stuff, or even though all of it is important. And one of the things that I've tried to do is create kind of a tree of knowledge thing, where I pick out what seems to me to be the important stuff, and I give for most of my life I've tried to stay away from study guides, but online I think maybe you need study guides, and I tell them you're just going to have to memorize this core piece of information, like the linguistic groups of southwestern Indians or something, and it's not particularly big, and you would think, well, that's not going to do them any good because they'll just wait till the test and then they'll go get that piece of paper and do it. But I know for a fact that this helps them at some level, because I can always tell, halfway through, everybody's supposed to read the syllabus, right? But halfway through the term, I'll get a bunch of emails saying, well, I'm just not doing very well on these exams. And I tell them, you should have read the syllabus where it says you have to memorize these things, and you're under a time constraint, so you have to know it before you go into the exam. And I mean, it makes total difference in what they do.
Yeah, so you've leveled with your students, and you make kind of an explicit distinction of, all right, here are some things that, whether you use the word memorize or not, but here's the things that you have to know to be able to use in these other contexts.
Yeah, you have the leaves are these other things that are not in the trunk, and I think that it works, but
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know if it's sound in terms of what of the perspectives that you bring to this.
So a trunk and leaf metaphor, all right, for prioritizing.
So speaking of study guides, is an example of the interleaving to have it scrambled if you're the one that gives the study guide out right before, a week or so before the exam, instead of doing it incremental as you go?
So that depends. How are students using it, or how do you envision that they're going to use the study guide?
Well, in the past, I've thought that they would fill it in as they go if I give it ahead of time and they do that, or a week before and they're putting it together to kind of get it in the sequence of how it was taught. So I always have done it in the sequence that it's taught.
Yeah.
But in interleaving, it's making me think now that maybe that's not a good idea.
Well, and I think that's great, if students are actually using the study guide to practice. It's essentially a more interactive thing and not hey, here's an outline or a structure of the material to refresh you on how it was structured. If that's how they're using it, then there's an argument to be made for interleaving. Now, here again, being really explicit with the students and saying, hey, I wasn't just randomizing this for no reason, but, and even if you don't use the word interleaving, you can say, hey, this actually helps you. So there's some method behind the madness, then I think that, what you're describing would make sense. All right, good.